On August 12, 1849, in what was supposed to be just another normal auction in Charleston, South Carolina, something happened that would quietly change American history. Among the many people being sold that day, there stood a small child. He was no more than 7 years old, silent and scared, holding something tightly against his chest. He was sold for just three, the price of 2 big bags of rice. But that small, shaking child would go on to change the future of the United States in ways no one there that morning could have ever imagined. His life would connect with the most important government offices during the Civil War. He would change how a nation remembered its own past and uncover secrets that some of America's most powerful families had spent many, many years trying to hide. But his name was erased. His life was hidden on purpose. For almost 100 years, his story lay buried under silence and shame until historians, piece by piece, began discovering the truth. The question isn't whether that 7-year-old changed America. The proof leaves no doubt. The real mystery is how a child sold for $3 could change the fate of an entire nation. Before we return to the story of this forgotten child, the one who rewrote history from the shadows, if you're listening from anywhere in the South or anywhere across America, drop a comment and tell us where you're from. Hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about this time in American history. Now, let's go back to that August morning in Charleston, 1849, to the moment when everything began. The harbor was filled with trading ships carrying cotton, rice, and indigo to faraway places. Their sails were bright against the humid southern sky. Beautiful mansions lined the waterfront. Their porches caught the sea breeze. While just blocks away, the slave markets operated as smoothly as any other business. The city's wealth depended completely on the work of enslaved people. Yet the white residents spoke of honor, tradition, and good manners, as if these good qualities could exist separately from the system that made them rich. The auction house on Chalmers Street was ordinary, a 2-story brick building with barred windows and a courtyard where people were displayed like farm animals before being sold. Samuel Rutledge, the auctioneer, had run the business for 15 years. He was proud of keeping detailed records, writing down not just names and prices, but also skills, physical features, and any special characteristics that might affect the selling price. His record books were very careful. Each entry was written in his neat handwriting. On that August morning, the heat was terrible. The kind of heat that made clothes stick to skin and turned the air thick as soup. Rutledge had 12 people to sell that day, ranging in age from 14 to 45. Most were field workers from a plantation in the low country that had fallen into debt. Standard merchandise, he called them in his private notes. The child arrived separately, brought in by a trader named Harrison Vance, who worked the coastal routes between Savannah and Charleston. Vance was known for finding unusual cases, people with special skills, those who could read or had training in crafts that could bring higher prices. But this child was different. Vance seemed almost eager to get rid of him. Found him in Savannah. Vance told Rutledge, wiping sweat from his forehead. Portuguese ship captain had him, said the boy's mother died on the ship. Fever took her 3 days out from wherever they came from. Captain was going to throw the child overboard, but someone paid him to bring the boy to shore. Don't know who, don't much care. Just want him sold and gone. The child stood in the corner of Rutledge's office, silent and watchful. His skin was darker than most of the enslaved people who passed through Charleston, suggesting he came from far from the American South. He was small for his age, thin from not having enough food, with eyes that seemed to take in everything without showing anything. He wore clothes that were too large, clearly hand-me-downs from an adult, and he held a small leather journal against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him connected to life. "What's with the book?" Rutledge asked. "Don't know." "Won't let go of it?" "Some kind of foreign writing inside." Showed it to a merchant who knows languages. He said it might be Arabic, but he wasn't sure. "Could be valuable if you find the right buyer. Could be worthless. Either way." The boy stays silent. "Haven't heard him speak a word since Savannah." Rutledge looked at the child more carefully. The silence was unusual, but not unheard of. Terrible experiences could steal a person's voice, especially a child's. The journal was strange, though. Books were dangerous in the hands of enslaved people. Reading and writing were against the law for them. Yet this child held the journal with a protectiveness that suggested it meant something very important to him. "How much are you asking?" Rutledge asked. "Whatever you can get. Give me $5 now and we'll call it even." "He's more trouble than he's worth to me." Rutledge agreed. $5 was nothing for the possible profit if the right buyer came along. Someone wealthy, perhaps looking for an unusual servant, or a scholar curious about the foreign writing. He entered the child into his record book with very little detail. Mild child, about 7 years old, origin unknown. Mute. Arrived with personal belongings including one journal. The auction began at 10:00 in the morning. The courtyard filled with buyers, plantation owners, overseers, merchants looking for house servants. The sales went forward with sad efficiency. By noon, 11 people had been sold. The child was last. Rutledge expected little interest. The boy was too young for heavy work. His silence and foreign appearance might be seen as problems, and his attachment to the journal would seem odd to practical buyers. But when the child was brought forward, something unexpected happened. A man stepped forward from the back of the crowd, a man Rutledge had never seen before. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing despite the heat, with a face that looked carved from stone. His accent when he spoke was clearly northern, possibly from Massachusetts or Connecticut. In Charleston in 1849, northern buyers were rare and often viewed with suspicion. "I'll give you $3 for the child," the man said. His voice carried across the courtyard with unusual clarity. 3. It was insultingly low. Routledge was about to refuse when the stranger added, "And I'll take the journal with him." Something in the way he said it made Routledge pause. This man knew about the journal. More than that, he wanted the journal specifically. The child was secondary. "The journal's worth more than $3 on its own," Routledge argued, sensing an opportunity. "The journal is worthless to you because you can't read it." The stranger replied, $3 for both, and I'm being generous." Routledge thought about it. He had 12 invested in the child, counting what he'd paid Vance and the cost of feeding and housing him for a week. $3 was a loss, but something about this stranger made him want to close the deal quickly. There was a strength in the man's eyes that was unsettling, a sense that saying no might lead to problems Routledge didn't want to explore. "Done," Routledge said, and the deal was recorded. The stranger paid in silver coins, took the child's hand, and left without giving his name. Routledge watched them disappear into the crowded streets of Charleston, and a cold feeling crept down his spine despite the terrible heat. He'd done thousands of sales in his career, but this one felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain. That night, he went home to his comfortable house on Trad Street, poured himself a large glass of whiskey, and tried to forget the child's watchful eyes. He didn't record the buyer's name in his record book. Later, when investigators asked why, Routledge would claim he'd simply forgotten, an unusual mistake for a man known for his careful records. But the truth, which he'd never admit publicly, was that he couldn't remember the stranger's face clearly, even hours after the sale. It was as if the man's features refused to stay fixed in his memory. The child and the stranger left Charleston that same afternoon on a coastal steamer heading north. No passenger list from that trip survives, though the ship's log confirms the vessel left on schedule. The steamer made stops in Wilmington, Norfolk, and Baltimore before continuing to Philadelphia. Somewhere along that route, the child and the stranger got off. Where exactly and what happened during that journey would remain unknown for over 10 years. What is known is this: in September 1849, a child matching the boy's description appeared at a Quaker school in rural Pennsylvania near the town of Lancaster. The school, run by a woman named Patience Hadley, provided education to free black children and secretly to escaped slaves moving through the Underground Railroad. Patience kept no official records. To do so would have put everyone in danger, but she wrote detailed personal diaries that survived in her family's possession. In her diary entry for September 18, 1849, Patience wrote, "A child has come to us, brought by a man who would not give his name. The boy does not speak, but his eyes show intelligence and deep sadness. He carries a book written in strange letters that none of us can understand. The man who brought him said only that the child must be taught to read and write English, and that under no circumstances should the book be taken from him. He left 50 in gold for the child's care, far more than necessary, and left before I could ask questions. I have the unsettling feeling that we've become guardians of something far more important than an orphan child." The child remained at the school for 4 years. During that time, he learned to speak and write English with amazing speed, though he never revealed his name or where he came from. The other students called him Book because of his constant companion. The journal he refused to let anyone read. Patience wrote about his progress in her diary, his skill with mathematics, his ability to memorize long passages of text after reading them just once, his habit of waking before dawn to practice writing by candlelight. But she also noted something troubling. Every few months, a different stranger would appear at the school asking about new students, specifically asking about any children who'd arrived with unusual possessions. Patience always said she knew nothing, but the pattern disturbed her. Someone was searching for the child. Multiple people, in fact, working separately from each other. In May 1853, when the child was about 11 years old, Patience made a decision that would change the course of his life. A traveling scholar had come through Lancaster, a man named Drummond, Edwin Hartwell, who studied ancient languages and worked for a private library in Philadelphia. Patience showed him the journal, hoping he might identify the language and perhaps help the child understand what his mother had left him. Dr. Hartwell examined the journal for 3 hours. When he finally looked up, his face had gone pale. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It belongs to one of my students." "Why, can you read it?" "I can read portions of it," Hartwell said carefully. "It's written in Arabic, but an old form mixed with symbols I've only seen in very old texts from North Africa." "Mrs. Hadley, this journal, it contains information that many people would consider dangerous. Historical records of events that certain powerful families would prefer remained forgotten." "What kind of events?" Hartwell closed the journal and handed it back to her. "The less you know, the safer you'll be. But I can tell you this, the child carrying this journal is in danger. If the wrong people discover what's written here, they'll do anything to get it. They'll kill for it." Patience felt ice spread through her veins. "What should I do?" "Teach him to be invisible," Hartwell said. "Han, for God's sake, teach him never to show that journal to anyone." Hartwell left that same day, and Patience never saw him again. But his warning proved true. 2 weeks later, in the middle of the night, 3 men broke into the school. They tore through the building, searching every room, questioning the children roughly about a boy with a foreign book. Patience and the older students drove them off with hunting rifles. But the message was clear. The child was no longer safe in Pennsylvania. Using contacts in the Underground Railroad, patients arranged for the boy to travel north into New York State to a community of free black families near Albany. She gave him what money she could spare and a letter of introduction to a family named Thatcher who would take him in. The night before he left, she asked him one question she'd never dared ask before. "Child, do you know what's written in that journal?" The boy, no longer quite a child but not yet a young man, looked at her with eyes that seemed far older than his years. "My mother told me," he said quietly. It was the first time patients had heard him mention his mother directly. "She said it's the truth about where we came from and where we were going. She said powerful men stole our history and wrote lies to replace it. She said this journal proves their lies and that's why they want it destroyed." "What history?" "Our history," the boy said. "African history. The history they don't want anyone to know because it shows that what they do to us, what they did to my mother, is built on theft and murder going back hundreds of years. The journal has names, places, deals, proof." Patience felt the weight of that knowledge settle onto her shoulders. "And you've kept it safe all these years?" "It's all I have of her," the boy said simply. "And it's the truth. The truth matters." He left the next morning. Patience never saw him again, but his words haunted her for the rest of her life. 4 years later, when she was an old woman watching the country tear itself apart in civil war, she would wonder if that child in his journal had somehow played a part in the great reckoning that came. She would wonder, but she would never know for certain. The boy arrived in Albany in June 1853 and was taken in by Marcus and Judith Thatcher, who ran a cooperage, a workshop that made barrels for merchant trade. Marcus was a free black man who'd purchased his freedom 20 years earlier. Judith had been born free in New York. They had no children of their own and welcomed the boy into their home, asking no questions about his past. The boy, who finally chose a name for himself, Thomas Freeman, representing both freedom and a fresh beginning, proved valuable to the cooperage. He had clever hands and a mind for mathematics that allowed him to calculate volumes and measurements faster than Marcus could with his traditional methods. The business grew stronger. But Thomas never forgot Dr. Hartwell's warning or the men who'd torn through Patience Hadley's school. He kept the journal hidden in a waterproof oilskin pouch buried beneath the cooperage floor. He told no one about it, not even the Thatchers, who treated him like a son. Albany in the 1850s was a city of intense political activity. The debate over slavery consumed the nation, and New York was divided between those who supported ending slavery and those with economic ties to the South. The Underground Railroad ran through the city, and both sides watched carefully for any advantage. Thomas listened to the debates in the streets and read newspapers whenever he could. He understood that the country was moving toward disaster, and he understood why. The system his mother had died in, the system that had nearly destroyed him, couldn't continue. It would either be torn down, or it would tear the nation apart. In 1857, the Supreme Court issued its decision in the Dred Scott case, declaring that black people could never be citizens. Thomas was 14 years old when he heard the news. That night, for the first time in years, he took out his mother's journal and read it again by candlelight. The journal was organized in sections. Some were written by his mother, others apparently copied from older sources she'd had access to. The earliest entries dated back to the 1700s and recorded deals between European traders and African merchants, deals that had been deliberately misrepresented in official records to justify the slave trade. His mother had somehow gotten access to account books, letters, and bills of sale that showed the intentional manipulation of paperwork to transform legitimate prisoners of war and criminals into supposedly permanent property. But there was more. Tucked into the later pages were names, American names, families in Charleston, Richmond, Savannah, and New Orleans who'd built their fortunes on the slave trade and who'd gone to extraordinary lengths to hide certain aspects of their involvement. His mother had listed dates of specific crimes, murders made to look like accidents, documents forged to claim ownership of free people, conspiracies to capture and sell free black children. Thomas realized his mother must have worked in a household with access to private papers, perhaps as a house servant for a merchant or trader. She'd copied these records secretly over years, documenting evidence that could destroy powerful families if it ever became public. No wonder people were hunting for the journal. It wasn't just a historical record. It was a weapon. Thomas made a decision that night. He would wait. He would keep the journal safe until the moment was right, until the country was ready to hear what it contained. He was young, but he was patient. He could afford to wait. The years passed. Thomas grew into a young man. The Thatchers' cooperage continued to do well, and Thomas became Marcus's full partner. He saved money carefully, invested wisely, and by 1860, at 17 years old, he owned a small house of his own. He'd learned to read and write perfectly in English, and he taught himself mathematics advanced enough to handle complex accounting. To anyone who knew him, he was simply a successful young craftsman and businessman. But beneath that surface, Thomas was preparing. He wrote letters to former students from Patience Hadley's school who'd scattered across the North. He made contacts with abolitionists and journalists. He carefully researched the families named in his mother's journal, confirming that they still existed and still held power. And then in April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the nation erupted into war. The Civil War changed everything. In Albany, young men joined Union Army units with patriotic enthusiasm. The cooperage business shifted to making containers for military supplies, gunpowder kegs, food barrels, water casks. Thomas was exempt from military service because his work was considered essential to the war effort. But he watched friends and neighbors march south, many never to return. In the chaos of war, information became currency. Both sides needed intelligence about the enemy's resources, leadership, and weaknesses. The Union government set up networks of spies and informers throughout the South, while Confederate agents worked in northern cities to gather information and sabotage Union efforts. In November 1862, a man appeared at Thomas's door. He introduced himself as Colonel Isaac Brennan, working for the War Department in Washington. Brennan was looking for information about Southern families, their finances, their business dealings, anything that might reveal Confederate supply networks or hidden assets. "I've heard you might have access to historical records about certain Charleston families," Brennan said carefully, watching Thomas's face. "Records that could prove useful to the Union cause." Thomas's blood ran cold. How had this man learned about the journal? Had someone from his past talked? Or was this simply bad luck that the one secret he'd guarded so carefully had been discovered at the worst possible moment? "I don't know what you're talking about," Thomas said. Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Mr. Freeman, I don't think you understand the situation. We're at war. The president has suspended habeas corpus. I could have you arrested right now and search your property without a warrant. But I'd rather we work together. The information you have could help us end this war faster. It could save thousands of lives. Who told you about me? That's not relevant. What's relevant is that journal you've been hiding since you were 7 years old. The journal your mother died protecting. Don't you think she'd want it used to destroy the system that killed her?" Thomas felt trapped. Everything Brennan said was true. His mother had wanted the journal to be revealed, but timing mattered. If the journal was revealed too soon or in the wrong way, it might cause more harm than good. The families named in it were powerful. They had connections in government, in banking, in the military itself. Expose them recklessly, and they'd find ways to bury the evidence and destroy anyone associated with it. "I need time to think," Thomas said. "You don't have time," Brennan replied. "But I'll give you 3 days. After that, I'll return with a warrant and soldiers." Brennan left. Thomas stood in his empty house, feeling the weight of 15 years of secrecy pressing down on him. That night, he got the journal from its hiding place and sat at his kitchen table reading by lamplight until dawn. His mother's handwriting filled the pages, small and careful. Each entry was proof of her courage and determination to document truth despite tremendous danger. One passage struck him with particular force. His mother had written, "They believe we are nothing. They believe we have no history worth remembering, no records worth preserving. They believe they can erase us from human memory. This journal is proof they're wrong. Whoever reads this, my son, if you survive, or anyone else who finds it, use this knowledge wisely. Truth is a weapon, but weapons can wound the person using them. Choose your moment carefully. Choose your moment carefully." His mother had known the journal's power and its danger. Thomas made his decision. He would give Brennan the journal, but not the original. Over the next 2 days, working through night and day, Thomas created a careful copy of the journal, writing every entry into a new ledger in his own handwriting. He translated the Arabic sections into English, making the information accessible to American readers. He checked the names and dates against newspapers and public records where possible, adding footnotes with supporting evidence. The result was a document that stood on its own, independent of the mysterious original, a document that could be verified, challenged, and debated. Not a religious text or ancient artifact, but a historical record supported by modern sources. When Brennan returned on the 3rd day, Thomas gave him the transcript along with copies of the supporting documents he'd compiled. "Where's the original?" Brennan demanded. "Safe," Thomas said. "If you want the information, that transcript contains everything you need. Names, dates, deals, all documented, all verifiable. Use it however you think best for the Union cause." Brennan examined the transcript carefully. This could embarrass some very important people. Some of these families still have influence in Washington. Then perhaps that influence needs to be challenged, Thomas said quietly. Brennan looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps it does. Thank you, Mr. Freeman. You've done your country a service." He left with the transcript. Thomas watched him disappear down the street, feeling both relief and worry. He'd given away his mother's secret, the burden he'd carried since childhood. But he'd done it on his own terms, in his own way. The original journal remained hidden, safe for future generations if needed. The information within it was now in the hands of people who could use it. Whether they would use it wisely remained to be seen. For 3 months, Thomas heard nothing. The war continued its brutal course. Battles raged across Virginia and Tennessee, and casualty lists filled newspaper pages. The transcript he'd given Brennan seemed to have disappeared into the bureaucracy of wartime Washington. Then in February 1863, strange things began to happen. A fire broke out in the warehouse next to Thomas's cooperage. Not a large fire, easily put out, but suspicious in its timing and location. An investigation suggested arson, though no one was ever caught. A week later, Thomas noticed he was being followed. Different men at different times, always keeping their distance, but always there. When he confronted one of them, the man claimed to be a federal marshal investigating Confederate sympathizers. When Thomas demanded to see identification papers, the man disappeared into a crowd. Letters Thomas sent to friends in other cities went missing. Letters sent to him arrived opened, clearly read by someone before delivery. His business began to suffer as long-time customers suddenly cancelled orders without explanation. Marcus Thatcher, now in his 60s, noticed the changes and confronted Thomas. "What have you gotten yourself into, son?" Thomas told him everything: the journal, the sale in Charleston, the years in hiding, the transcript given to Colonel Brennan. Marcus listened without interruption, his weathered face growing more concerned with each revelation. "You poked a hornet's nest," Marcus said when Thomas finished. "These powerful families you've documented, they're not going to let themselves be exposed without a fight. War or no war, they have resources, they have connections, and they're clearly trying to frighten you. What should I do?" "Leave Albany tonight if possible. Go somewhere they can't find you easily. I have a cousin in Michigan who owns a lumber mill near Saginaw. No one would think to look for you there. You can work, stay safe, and wait for this storm to pass." Thomas resisted at first. Running felt like surrender, like abandoning the cause his mother had died for. But Marcus was firm, and Judith supported him. That evening, Thomas packed his essentials, including the original journal wrapped in oilskin and leather, and left Albany on the night train to Buffalo. He never saw the Thatchers again. 3 weeks after his departure, the cooperage burned to the ground in a fire that killed Marcus and seriously injured Judith. The official report called it an accident, a lantern knocked over in the workshop. But Thomas knew better. They'd been targeted because of him, because of what he'd set in motion by giving that transcript to Brennan. The guilt was crushing. Thomas spent the spring of 1863 working in Michigan lumber camps, trying to outrun both his pursuers and his conscience. He sent money to Judith for her medical care, but she died in June. Her injuries had never healed properly. Thomas felt responsible for both deaths, and the weight of that responsibility nearly destroyed him. But in July, something happened that changed everything. The Battle of Gettysburg ended in Union victory, and suddenly the war's momentum shifted. More importantly, Thomas received a letter forwarded through multiple addresses to keep it secret. The letter was from a journalist named Harriet Weston who worked for an abolitionist newspaper in Boston. She'd received portions of Thomas's transcript through channels she couldn't reveal. She'd verified many of the claims through her own research. She was preparing a series of articles exposing the historical crimes documented in the transcript, but she needed Thomas's help to confirm certain details and, if possible, to view the original journal to ensure accuracy. "The country is changing," Harriet wrote. "President Lincoln has issued the Emancipation Proclamation. The question of slavery is no longer political, it's moral. Your mother's documentation could help ensure that when this war ends, the truth about how this system was built cannot be denied or forgotten. Please contact me. Let's finish what she started." Thomas read the letter 3 times. Here was the opportunity he'd been waiting for, a way to ensure his mother's work would be recognized, that her sacrifice would mean something. But accepting meant coming out of hiding, making himself a target again. He thought about Marcus and Judith, about Patience Hadley, about his mother whose name he'd never known, whose face he could barely remember. They'd all risked everything for truth and freedom. How could he do less? Thomas wrote back to Harriet Weston, agreeing to meet. But before he revealed himself, he needed to take one more precaution. He traveled to Detroit and placed the original journal in a bank vault with instructions that it should only be released to specific individuals, Harriet Weston, or if she was unavailable, to the offices of the abolitionist newspaper, or failing that, to the Library of Congress. If he died or disappeared, the journal would eventually be made public. The truth would survive even if he didn't. Only then did Thomas travel to Boston to meet Harriet Weston and begin the work of transforming his mother's documentation into a weapon against the system that had enslaved them both. Just when the weight of Thomas's journey seemed almost too heavy to bear alone, Harriet Weston proved to be more than just a journalist seeking a story. If this account of one child's burden, carrying the truth through a country tearing itself apart, moves you, share this tale with someone who values hidden histories. Hit that like button if you believe some truths are worth any sacrifice, and subscribe to discover how this unlikely partnership would finally bring those buried secrets into the light. Let's continue with what happened when these two determined souls joined forces in the summer of 1863. Harriet Weston was 42 years old when she met Thomas Freeman in Boston in August 1863. She'd been writing for abolitionist newspapers since the 1840s, documenting the realities of slavery through interviews with escaped slaves and free black communities. She'd seen her articles censored, her office torn apart, and her life threatened. But she'd never stopped writing because she believed that words, properly used, could change the world. When Thomas entered her office on Tremont Street, Harriet saw immediately what the boy purchased for $3 had become: a young man of 20, careful and watchful, carrying burdens far too heavy for someone his age. But she also saw determination and a quiet strength that reminded her of the best people she'd encountered in her decades of activism. "Tell me everything," she said, and Thomas did. The telling took hours. Harriet listened without interruption as Thomas described the auction house, the silent years, the schools and safe houses, the journal he'd protected through it all. When he finished, she sat back in her chair and studied him carefully. "Do you understand what you're offering me?" she asked. "This isn't just a story. This is evidence that could destroy powerful families. It could make you a target for the rest of your life." "I've been a target since I was 7 years old," Thomas replied quietly. The difference now is that I'm old enough to fight back. Harriet nodded slowly. Then we'll fight together. But we do this properly. Every claim verified, every name checked, every date confirmed. We give them no opening to dismiss this as fantasy or lies. They worked together for 3 months, and the process was painstaking. Harriet had contacts throughout New England, archivists, historians, clerks in government offices who shared her abolitionist sympathies. She sent letters to archives in Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New York, requesting copies of ship manifests, property deeds, and bills of sale from the early 1700s. Thomas worked alongside her, translating sections of the journal and cross, referencing his mother's entries with the documents Harriet obtained. What emerged was more detailed and more damning than either had expected. The journal didn't just document individual crimes, it revealed systematic patterns. The same families appeared repeatedly across decades. Their business relationships were intertwined. Their legal manipulations were coordinated. They'd created what amounted to a conspiracy spanning generations, each new generation inheriting not just wealth, but the methods and connections necessary to maintain the fiction that their system was legitimate. One case consumed weeks of research. In 1731, a Charleston merchant named William Cresswell had purchased a group of survivors from a slave ship that had wrecked during a storm. Among the survivors was a man named Kofi who carried papers proving he was a merchant from the Gold Coast traveling on legitimate business. Rather than honor these documents, Cresswell had them destroyed and sold Kofi as a slave. When Kofi's business partners in London sent inquiries, Cresswell claimed the entire ship had been lost with no survivors. Thomas's mother had documented this in extraordinary detail, including transcriptions of letters between Cresswell and other merchants discussing how to handle complications when educated Africans arrived with documentation of their free status. The letters revealed a deliberate strategy: destroy the papers, isolate the individuals, sell them quickly to inland plantations where they'd have no access to ports or legal help, and maintain believable denial if questioned. Harriet traced Cresswell's descendants. The family still existed in 1863, now prominent in South Carolina banking and politics. One of William Cresswell's great-grandsons was serving as a Confederate officer. The wealth that financed his education and position traced directly back to his ancestors' fraud. This is what we need, Harriet said, studying the documentation spread across her desk. Not just historical crimes, but direct lines connecting past fraud to present power. Show people that this isn't ancient history. It's the foundation their modern world is built on. By October, they had compiled enough material for a series of 5 articles. Harriet's editor at the newspaper, a cautious man named Edmund Pierce, read the first draft and went pale. Harriet, these are serious accusations against families with considerable influence. Some have relatives in Congress. Are you absolutely certain of your sources? Every fact has been verified, Harriet assured him. Every name, every date, every transaction. Thomas's mother didn't document rumors. She documented crimes she had direct evidence of. And if they sue us, then we'll produce the evidence in court. That might be the best outcome. A public forum to present everything we've found. Pierce struggled with the decision for a week before finally agreeing to publish. The first article appeared on October 15, 1863, under the headline, Foundations of Fraud: How America's Slave System Was Built on Systematic Deception. The response was immediate and violent. Within days, Harriet received threatening letters promising arson, assault, and murder. Someone threw a brick through her office window with a note attached. Lies have consequences. 2 men attempted to force their way into her apartment. Only the intervention of neighbors who heard her screams prevented worse. Thomas faced similar harassment. Men followed him openly now, not bothering to hide their surveillance. His landlady, frightened by the attention, asked him to leave. He moved 3 times in 2 weeks, each time finding new lodgings only to be forced out again when his pursuers located him. But the articles also found defenders. Abolitionist societies throughout New England reprinted them. Ministers cited them in sermons. Frederick Douglass himself wrote a response praising the documentation and calling for further investigation into the historical crimes revealed. The controversy grew so intense that it reached Washington. In November, Harriet received word that a congressional committee wanted to examine the evidence. Some committee members were genuinely interested in historical truth. Others wanted to discredit the articles and protect the families being accused. The summons arrived for Thomas in December. He was to appear before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War in January 1864, bringing whatever documentation he claimed supported his allegations. Thomas prepared carefully. He brought the transcript, now extensively annotated with supporting documents. He brought copies of ship manifests, property deeds, and court records that Harriet had collected. But he did not bring the original journal. That remained in Detroit in a bank vault, protected by legal arrangements that would make it public if anything happened to him. The journey to Washington took 2 days. Thomas traveled with Harriet and Edmund Pierce, who'd agreed to accompany them as a witness to the verification process they'd conducted. They arrived on January 10, 1864, in a capital city transformed by war. Soldiers filled the streets, hospitals overflowed with wounded men, and the atmosphere was tense with military urgency. The hearing took place in a committee room in the Capitol building. 13 congressmen and senators sat in judgment, their faces ranging from sympathetic to openly hostile. Gallery seats were filled with journalists, abolitionists, and representatives of the families being accused, all waiting to see how the testimony would unfold. Thomas stood before them and told his story. He spoke for 2 hours, describing the auction in Charleston, the journal his mother had protected, the verification process he and Harriet had conducted. He answered questions about specific entries, about his mother's possible sources, about how a house servant could have accessed the private papers of merchants and traders. My mother worked in households that dealt in this trade, Thomas explained. Over many years, she copied documents when opportunities arose. She understood the risk. She did it anyway because she believed the truth mattered more than her safety. Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania, the committee's most radical abolitionist, pressed for details. And you've kept this journal safe for 15 years, through multiple moves, through people hunting for it. Yes, sir. It was all I had of her, and it was the truth she died to preserve. But Senator James Bayard of Delaware, a Democrat with family ties to Southern plantation owners, was less sympathetic. You were 7 years old when you supposedly acquired this journal. How can we trust your memory of events from that time? How do we know you didn't make up this entire story, perhaps with Miss Weston's help, to slander honorable families during wartime? Thomas met his gaze steadily. Senator, I didn't fabricate the ship manifests in the Massachusetts archives. I didn't fabricate the property deeds in Charleston. I didn't fabricate the court records in Rhode Island. All of those documents exist independently, created decades before I was born. My mother's journal doesn't create these records. It explains the connections between them. It reveals the pattern that individual documents don't show. Harriet testified next, describing her verification process in meticulous detail. She'd brought copies of every document they'd referenced, organized chronologically and by family. She walked the committee through specific cases, showing how the journal's claims matched historical records. The journal told us where to look, she explained. It provided names and dates that allowed us to find supporting evidence in public archives. If Mr. Freeman had fabricated this, he would have needed access to archives across 6 states and the ability to understand how documents from different repositories connected to each other. That's not believable for a man of his age and background. The only reasonable explanation is that the journal is genuine. The committee debated for 3 days. Some members wanted to dismiss the allegations immediately, calling them wartime propaganda designed to damage the Confederacy. Others recognized the historical significance of the documentation and called for further investigation. Finally, a compromise emerged. A small group of scholars, historians, linguists, and document experts would be allowed to examine the original journal under controlled circumstances. If they could verify its authenticity, the committee would issue findings about its historical value. If they found evidence of fabrication, the matter would be closed and Thomas could face charges of fraud. Thomas agreed. In April 1864, he traveled to Detroit with 5 scholars, 2 congressional representatives, and a stenographer to document everything that occurred. They met at the bank where the journal was stored, in a private room with guards outside to ensure security. The examination was thorough. Dr. Philip Ashbury, a historian from Harvard, analyzed the paper and ink, comparing them to other documents from the early 1800s. Professor John Whitfield, a linguist specializing in Arabic, examined the script and language, looking for anachronisms or inconsistencies. Dr. Rebecca Chen, one of the few female scholars allowed to participate, studied the handwriting and compared it to known samples from the period. For 2 days, they tested every aspect of the journal. They examined the binding, the wear patterns on the pages, the way the ink had faded over time. They compared entries in the journal to historical events that could be verified through other sources. They looked for any evidence that the journal had been created recently and artificially aged. On the evening of the 2nd day, the scholars delivered their preliminary findings to the congressional representatives. Dr. Ashbury spoke for the group. Gentlemen, we have examined this document as thoroughly as current methods allow. The paper is consistent with manufacturing techniques from the 1820s and 1830s. The ink matches formulations common in that period. The Arabic script shows characteristics of North African writing styles from that era. The wear patterns and aging are consistent with a document that has been handled carefully but repeatedly over several decades. What about the content? One representative asked. The entries reference events and documents that have only recently been rediscovered in archives, Professor Whitfield explained. Information that would not have been accessible to the general public, and certainly not to a 7-year-old child in 1849. Some of the ships mentioned in the journal, we verified their existence through port records that aren't widely available. The level of detail about trade practices, legal procedures, and family connections requires access to primary sources that Mr. Freeman couldn't possibly have had as a child. Dr. Chen added her assessment. The handwriting shows variation consistent with multiple writing sessions over an extended period. There are corrections, additions, changes in ink that suggest this wasn't created all at once. This is a journal that was compiled over time by someone with persistent access to confidential information. Everything about this document indicates authenticity. The congressional representatives looked at each other. One of them, a man who'd been openly skeptical of Thomas's claims, spoke quietly. So you're saying this is real, all of it? We're saying. Dr. Ashbury replied carefully that this journal was created in the period it claims to represent by someone with extraordinary access to information about the slave trade, and that its contents can be verified against independent historical sources. Whether that makes it real in the sense of proving criminal conspiracy, that's a legal and historical judgment beyond our expertise. But as a historical document, yes, it's authentic. The news reached Washington within a week. The committee issued its findings in May 1864. The journal was genuine, the documentation credible, and the historical claims worthy of serious scholarly attention. They stopped short of calling for legal action. Too much time had passed, and the war made such proceedings impractical. But they acknowledged that the journal revealed disturbing patterns of fraud and systematic violation of human rights in the establishment of American slavery. The scholars' report changed everything. What had been controversial accusations became accepted historical fact. The families named in the journal could no longer simply deny the claims. They had to deal with verified documentation and scholarly consensus. Some families responded by trying to distance themselves from their ancestors' actions. They made public donations to Freedman schools and hospitals, attempting to demonstrate that they rejected the sins of previous generations. Others retreated into angry denial, claiming that the standards of the past couldn't be judged by the morality of the present. A few families took more direct action. In June 1864, Thomas received a visitor at his boarding house in Boston, a well-dressed woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Catherine Harrington Sutherland, great-granddaughter of the merchant whose crimes have been most thoroughly documented in the journal, Mr. Freeman. She said, her voice carefully controlled, "I've come to apologize for what my ancestor did to yours." Thomas was stunned into silence. He'd expected threats, legal challenges, or attempts at bribery. He hadn't expected this. Sutherland continued, "I've read your testimony. I've read Miss Weston's articles. I've examined the family papers that were never meant to be seen by outsiders. Everything you've claimed about William Cresswell is true. He destroyed lives to build his fortune, and my family has benefited from his crimes for generations. I cannot undo what he did, but I can acknowledge it, and I can try to make what amends are possible." She placed a document on the table between them. "This is a legal instrument transferring property that has been in my family since 1735. Property purchased with profits from the trade my ancestor engaged in. I'm donating it to be used for a school for freedmen. It's not enough. It can never be enough. But it's what I can do." Thomas looked at the document, then at Mrs. Sutherland. "Why?" "Because the truth matters," she said simply. "Because your mother was right to document what she witnessed, and you were right to preserve it. Because my children deserve to inherit something better than wealth built on lies and suffering." She left, and Thomas never saw her again. But her actions started something. Over the following months, 3 other families made similar gestures: donations, public acknowledgments, small attempts at restitution that could never fully address the magnitude of historical injustice, but represented recognition that it had occurred. Thomas remained in Boston through the end of the war, working with Harriet on additional research. They documented more cases, traced more family connections, built a more complete picture of how the system had been constructed and maintained. Their work became foundational for a new generation of scholars studying the economic and legal structures of American slavery. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April 1865, Thomas was 22 years old. He attended the celebration in Boston Common, standing in a crowd of thousands as speakers proclaimed the end of slavery and the beginning of a new era. He thought about his mother, who'd never lived to see this day, and Marcus and Judith, who'd died protecting him, and Patience Hadley, who'd given him the education that made everything else possible. The work wasn't finished. He knew that. The war had ended slavery as a legal institution, but it hadn't ended the racial hierarchy built to justify it. The families documented in the journal still held wealth and influence. The patterns of exploitation would find new forms, but the truth was now part of the historical record, available to anyone willing to look. That mattered. After the war, Thomas returned to Michigan. He married Sarah Jenkins, a schoolteacher he'd met through abolitionist circles, and they built a quiet life in Saginaw. They had 4 children, and Thomas taught each of them about the grandmother they'd never known, the woman who documented truth at the cost of her life. He never spoke publicly about the journal again. Journalists occasionally sought him out, hoping for new revelations, but Thomas always declined. The journal spoke for itself. His mother's work spoke for itself. He saw no need to add to it. But privately, he continued to write letters to scholars and historians who wanted to understand that period better. He shared what he remembered, clarified details, and helped researchers connect the dots between documented crimes and their lasting consequences. His input shaped dozens of academic works published in the decades following the war. In 1891, at the age of 48, Thomas donated the original journal to the Library of Congress with careful instructions about its preservation and accessibility. He wanted it available to researchers but protected from those who might still want to destroy it. The library agreed to his terms, and the journal found its final home in the manuscript division, where it remains today. Thomas died in 1912 at 69, having lived long enough to see the promise of Reconstruction betrayed and Jim Crow laws establish new systems of oppression. His later letters show a man struggling with disappointment that the truth he'd helped reveal hadn't transformed the country as much as he'd hoped. But he never expressed regret about bringing the journal to light. The truth mattered even when people chose to ignore it. Harriet Weston continued her journalism until failing health forced her retirement in 1887. She wrote dozens of articles and 2 books expanding on the research she'd done with Thomas, always crediting him as a collaborator and honoring his mother's courage. When she died in 1889, Thomas traveled to Boston for her funeral. one of hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched through her relentless commitment to truth and justice. The stranger who purchased Thomas in Charleston remained a mystery. Despite decades of research, neither Thomas nor later historians ever identified him. Some guessed he was an abolitionist working underground. Others suggested he might have been a member of a secret society dedicated to preserving dangerous knowledge. Thomas himself believed the man had known exactly what the journal contained and had recognized that a child would be the safest guardian for such explosive information. But he never knew for certain, and the mystery became another thread in an already extraordinary story. Samuel Rutledge, the auctioneer, died in 1873, having lost everything in the war. His auction house burned during Union occupation, and most of his records were destroyed. The single ledger page recording Thomas's sales survived only because Rutledge had kept it separately, perhaps sensing even then that this particular transaction was different from all the others. After the war, when investigators questioned him about certain sales, he produced that page, never realizing he was documenting the origin point of a story that would help unravel the system he'd profited from. The families documented in the journal faced varying fates. Some, like the Harringtons through Catherine Sutherland, acknowledged their ancestors' crimes and attempted restitution. Others fought the allegations until their dying days, spending fortunes on lawyers and public relations campaigns that ultimately failed to erase the historical record. Several families simply disappeared from public life, their names vanishing from society registers as they retreated from scrutiny. By the early 1900s, Thomas Freeman's story had become something of a legend in African American communities. The child sold for $3 who'd helped expose the fraudulent foundations of slavery. But the full details were largely forgotten by the broader public until the civil rights movement of the 1960s brought renewed interest in hidden histories. In 1968, researchers at Howard University rediscovered the journal in the Library of Congress archives. They published the first complete translation, making the contents accessible to readers who couldn't read Arabic. The publication sparked new scholarship examining the economic and legal structures of slavery using Thomas's mother's documentation as a primary source. Thomas's descendants, still living in Michigan, watched this renewed interest with mixed feelings. They were proud of their ancestors' courage, but also aware that the work he'd started remained unfinished. The systems he'd exposed had evolved, but they hadn't disappeared. The truth he'd helped preserve was still needed, still relevant, still challenging Americans to confront their history honestly. The journal itself remains in the Library of Congress. Its pages are fragile but readable, available to researchers who make appointments to study it. Every few years, a new discovery emerges. A forgotten ledger entry, a faded letter, a connection no one noticed before, and the record of what truly happened grows just a little clearer. Piece by piece, the past begins to speak again. What do you think about Thomas Freeman's journey and the unimaginable sacrifice his mother made so that he could live? Do you believe there are still untold histories waiting beneath the surface? Stories deliberately hidden because their truths would unsettle those who benefited from silence. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, pass it on to someone who values the forgotten corners of American history. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell to hear more stories like this. Stories of ordinary people whose courage reshaped the world. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. Until the next story, remember, history isn't only what happened. It's what we choose to remember, what we choose to uncover, and what we fight to preserve. Keep questioning, keep searching, keep honoring those who came before.